What are space nets and how do you build them? Check it out on this episode of How Not to Highline.
Space nets are a great opportunity to bring an entire slackline community together out on the slackline. They're also a great platform for other sports like base jumping or just hanging out over the water. Space nets are a great project for anyone, but keep in mind you need a lot of slackline knowledge and some equipment to set them up and use them properly. This is your space net build. We're just going to show you how we built ours so you can make fewer mistakes building yours.
Who knew you need a lot of space to build your space net? We didn't when we started. We tried to do it in my backyard. Trying to build a 16-foot sided space net in a very small backyard doesn't work too well. So I'll advise you to make sure that the logistics of where you're going to set the space net up and build it are already there. Not where you're going to rig it, but where you're actually going to build the thing. It takes a while. It's a very time-intensive process. And because of this, you want to make sure that you have a place to set it up for a long duration of time. I built mine by myself over the course of 4 days, and we built Anthony's over the course of 2 days. That whole time we left it up. It was much easier, much more efficient, and saved us probably an hour a day breaking it up and setting it up and breaking it down. Therefore, if you're going to build it, and before you go out and get all these materials and have nowhere to go, make sure that you have a spot that you know you're going to build your space net. Be it the park, be it behind your house, a garage, anything. Just make sure that you have those logistics in mind before starting the build project.
To build a space net, you're going to need a few extra materials besides what the space net is just actually made out of. To start, you're going to need some rope or extra slackline to hold up the sides. You're probably not going to use your main slackline because it's going to be up for a while, but anything you can use works. You're also going to need a pulley system or a tensioning system. You could even use a primitive system. You're going to use that to bring a side to tension when you build it. You're also going to need some attachments to hook up to the corners. Whether that be soft shackles or carabiners, doesn't really matter. Soft shackles are a great option because it keeps it light, and also Ryan has a great video on how to make soft shackles. Something else that's really helpful and crucial is FIDs, or a FID set. FIDs are awesome for weaving rope inside of other rope or burying rope, and without it, it's just a huge pain in the ass. Just get some good FIDs for whatever size rope you're working with. Something that also helped us is we made a big plywood circle with nails in it. That way, instead of trying to estimate the size of the hole in the middle, we could just wrap it around and find out how much rope we need for the perimeter. Anything else you might need would be something like tape measures, tape, or markers to help the preliminary planning go a lot easier.
To build a space net and even set one up, you're going to need no knots. Now, the knots we were familiar with, thought they were easy to inspect, and were very strong. These knots involve the girth hitch, the clove hitch, the square knot, fisherman, and the modified Brummel.
To build your space net, you're going to need some materials. You got to consider and properly plan your space net before actually building it and buying the materials. So we broke it down to 3 main points. You've got your outside perimeter, which can either be very beefy static rope, very beefy Dyneema, or some span sets. With the span sets, which is the traditional option, you can opt to either double it back, or if you have a beefy enough span set, so to do a pattern like this, where you have single strands. This can only be used if your span set is strong enough. This is what we opted for. Then you have the second section is the infill, or what kind of materials you want to use inside the span set. Inside the span set perimeter. You can use either paracord, which is very stretchy. We use 550 paracord. Or you could use Dyneema, which is not stretchy at all. The difference is with paracord, when you bring this space net to tension, you're going to be able to lounge about in it and you're going to be able to sag in it. Whereas with Dyneema, it's going to be very tight and static because Dyneema is a very static rope, and it could potentially be not as comfortable as paracord. This is all things to consider on your specific space net build. Then you also have diverters when you get over 13-foot sides, but we will explain that more later.
Once you have all your material, you want to make sure you plan properly to be able to measure it out and cut all your ropes down to size. Now, when it comes to measuring, you want to take out your triangle of a span set or rope, whatever you chose to do, and pick your corners and measure them out. Then, from there, you want to actually measure out your static rope. You want to make sure you're taking into account if you have a circle in the middle or if you're just stringing it across, just for extra support and sectioning off those little sections that you're making with all the triangles. When it comes to the infill space, you want to make sure you're measuring out on the actual span set or static rope, whatever you opt to use, the distance between them. You want to make sure you set that up correctly so you have an evenly spaced out weave between the whole net. We'll get to the actual weave later, but make sure you just have those set up correctly as of now. When it comes to cutting, make sure you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, find someone who can help you. Now, you want to plan properly for it. You want to make sure you cut a little more than you need to leave some breathing room for your knots, and just in general, whether you make a mistake or anything.
You have all your materials, you've done all your planning, so let's get to building this space net. So first, we're going to have to set up through the skeleton phase. So first, you're going to set up your span set. String it up in the triangle configuration that you'd like and that you've marked out. And if it's over 13 feet on the edges, then you're going to need a diverter. Now, a diverter helps to equalize the forces throughout the infill and the edges of the space net, and also creates another point for you to clip into while you're on the space net. Diverters can be just simple lines from the edges, or they can be lines from the edges to the middle. The point being, though, is if you're going to use diverters, you need to measure exactly to the center of the given edge you're working on. Another option that we decided to take was to add edging. Now, edging helps to keep your infill in place. It keeps the weaves from migrating up or down along the span set, and it also provides a little bit more strength and security and simplicity when rigging your net.
Alright, so now we're going to explain to you exactly what we did. Here is a space net. We had 16-foot sides on the space net, and the corners are anchored with 4-inch soft shackles. Then what we did is we set up the diverter, which is the midpoint, so at 8 feet from an end. We set up the diverter static rope to the center. What we did is we tied a circle. I have a 3-foot diameter circle. Anthony has a much smaller circle because he didn't want to fit through it. But we tied a circle. You don't have to, it's completely optional, but this is what we did. I'm showing you our design specs. Then what we did is we strung it with the edging from the Dyneema. We did one continuous loop, so we started at a side, we went up, over, we actually passed under, around, under, through, under. Now that went under this way, under, and then under, and then we did the modified Brummel knot there. I would not recommend doing this. I would recommend doing one side, each side continuously on its own, but I'm showing you our design specs. Then what we did is we did the infill with 550 paracord. We were able to get 19 different spots, segments throughout the side, and we doubled it back to make it 38 different spots each side, not including the diverters. These are 5.25 inches separation. This is crucial because what essentially you do is, since it's on the edging, if you modify the edging, this will shift with it. So make sure that all of them are parallel. We have more on that in later videos. But essentially it's 5.25 between each one. Now you will also have some on here, and with this and also the ones on the diverter, we had a total of 21 different strands that were doubled back to make 42 different strands of Dyneema. This makes it certified to roughly 22,000 pounds on each trident. The span set itself is rated for 14,000 pounds span set, and the edging, which is Dyneema, was 7/64 Dyneema, which is 1,400 pounds MBS. This is crucial. You want to make sure that your space net is not going to break before the line does. You want to make sure that nothing within the space net will break. And since you're doing this yourself, you have to be very cautious about how you're building it. This is how we did it. This is how we would recommend to do it. And we'll show you how we did it.
All right, so let's take a look at a close-up of how this was actually woven. So you begin by alternating from the previous section that you did on termination with the fisherman's. So you begin 5¼ inches down with a fisherman's right here, which is then spliced through the rope, through the edging, through the other edging side, and then girth hitched on this side, which then it comes back up midway between the 5¼ inch markings and is spliced through. This is when the weaving begins. It goes over between the first one from above, and then under, and then over again, under, over, and then you always end opposite how you started, so you end with an under. Comes back up to the halfway, goes through the edging, and is clove hitched over here, which is then tied off with a stopper knot, whether that be a barrel knot or a square knot, however you decide to do this. And with this pattern, the edges continue to multiply as you go further down, and the bowing begins to create a circular shape, which matches up perfectly with your diverter.
First, you gotta set up your space net. Now, you wanna pick a spot where all the sides will be equal. You don't need to rig it in a spot where all sides are equal, but it makes the building process of the space net much easier. As you can see in my pole barn, we made sure that it's essentially an equilateral triangle. You could have modified this based on how long we wanted the sides to be, but we wanted it to be as even as possible. Now you can see me building the pegboard that Anthony talked about, which is a perfect circle for the inside. This helped me get a gauge for what the circle looked like while stringing the Dyneema through the tridents. This isn't necessary, but it was definitely a useful tool with our first times doing it to have an idea of where everything's going to lay in the long run. So we're out here rigging the space net at night, trying to do the skeleton. Bad video, but I'm going to show you that how we tied the circle in the middle of the space net. So we got a length of rope. We're doing a 3 foot wide, 3 foot diameter circle. So we multiplied that by pi. We used roughly 9 feet of rope. We tied a double fisherman's at the end to stop it to make it one continuous loop. And then we're going to rig it up with some more static rope in the middle of these space nets. Yes, we have the space net rigged in my backyard to a pulley system, to 2 trees. We have Anthony and Kevin working on the interior, what I like to call a skeleton, which is our static rope for the rope circle. It looks more like a triangle now, but that's because we don't have all the paracord helping to equalize it. It's looking beautiful. What do you say, boys?
Got that tape measure? So the way we've woven this isn't exactly a science. This whole thing isn't exactly a science, but the way we've woven it is taken the 7/64 Dyneema and started from a knot, and we'll run this way all the way up the leg, all the way down until we get back to one of these knots, and then we'll go through the middle of the triple fisherman's to the other side, and then down the back end of this leg, and down this stretch, and then repeat with the next leg, all the way down to here, come back on this side, go all the way across, and then repeat for this triangle, and then repeat. And that's the entire thing.
You're live. All right, so what we do here is we're setting up each side of the triangle, and to set it up, what we do is we want to make sure that the Dyneema is a little loose because it's going to bunch up with how many splices. We're doing 42 splices each side, so it's going to tend to bunch up. I've come to learn that this much sag is optimal, maybe a little less, and since we have it continually strung, the way we have it working is that at the end, right here, to begin doing the lines on each side, we splice it straight through, make sure that the cord, the paracord is straight, we tie it, and then we tie it through the shackle so the shackle stays here in this spot with the paracord and along the span set. And what we're going to do is we're going to base all the other lines and splices off of this splice. So you want to make sure that this splice is perfect, and you also want to make sure that that the Dyneema strands are running properly. If they're not running properly, it might bunch up and it might be very difficult and mess up the geometry of your circle in the center. Now, the way that would happen is if one of these is way too tight, which is connected to an already done segment, then it will continue bunching up and continue to be tighter and tighter, which you do not want. You want to make sure that the Dyneema attached to the already done segment is optimally loose, which is what I have it as here. I have it loose in the center, and that's what we have done. Now what we do is we want to make sure that the Dyneema is strung so that this is going to be parallel strands all the way down to the center. We want to move it so that it's parallel. That's about right. And then we're going to base 5 1/4 inches all the way down 19 times. That's what we're going to do. We're going to do it, and we're going to get back to you.
So we've begun the weave, and like we said, we spaced it off of our first knot up here, which keeps the Dyneema in place. And you can see it's lining up perfectly. Every 5 1/2 inches, we've marked here on the Dyneema with some Sharpie where each splice begins. And how you do a splice is that you run it through both ends on either side and take one end, should be, I don't know, about 1 foot, some love for a knot. And the other end, in order to get the right length cut, you pass it once all the way over and get an arm length and some love on the end. And that should be just about perfect when you start wrapping it around itself like this, when it all comes together.
So now we're going to run the first strands of paracord. To run the weave pattern, as Anthony already detailed, we're going to run a straight line across first from a fisherman's knot to a girth hitch. Now we're doing it all from the same side here, and I would recommend to not do it all from the same side. We should alternate, but we didn't know this going into it, so ours is going to be a little messed up down the road. Doesn't alter the strength any. It does alter a little bit of the look towards the diverters. That is the only difference. Okay, so we just got done doing the whole segment of stringing it out with a fisherman on one side and a girth hitch on the other. And what we're going to do now is we're going to send the rope that's all hanging on the other side back through. We're going to loop it through each string, starting with one end. There's going to be 1 loop here, 2 loops, 3 loops, all the way to 18 loops. The spacing here is about 5 1/4 inches in between each segment. To optimize the spacing, make sure that it's going to lay evenly and every line is in parallel, which is perfect. It looks like that worked. We know the Dyneema is here to keep this all in place so that it doesn't slide around, because this is able to slide around, the span set's able to slide around, but the Dyneema keeps it in place. Now what we have is at the end a little knot right here with a fisherman's, a girth hitch, all the way around to another stopper knot, which is I tied a fisherman's again to cinch down on the girth hitch so that this will not move at all. This will keep the Dyneema in place, wrapped around the soft shackle. The soft shackle stays here. This never comes off the space net. And I'm going to check back in once I'm done looping everything. Hello everyone, so we're starting it off. We have the first 5 done, and I'm going to show you how to weave it through properly. So as you can tell, you start from the girth hitch side, you splice it halfway between, so that should be 2.125 inches in between. You run it over one strand, under, over, under. You can keep running it over the strand closer to the end, and then under the strand closest to the circle. And you want to make sure that you hit every single in between. And then you're going to end with an over, and you're going to end with an under since you start with an over. And that under is going to go straight through. We're going to splice it halfway through. Bada bing. We're going to splice it. And it's going to go straight through to a clove hitch. So I'm just going to tie a clove hitch right here. That way we can adjust it as we're trying to tension it much easier than a girth hitch. And then we'll tie a stopper knot once it's all to tension. All right, we're going to do the rest of this. Notice how when we're weaving it, the weave generally tends to pull the span set in, making it less of a triangle and more of the circular path that we were talking about in the beginning of the video. Also, how the paracord tends to make a pretty perfect circle as it's getting closer and closer to diverters. As you get closer and closer to the diverters, the way the weave pattern sets is that it forms to a circle towards the inside.
Okay, so on the first go around of making a space net on Rocco's, what we did, and on this trident, is what we did is we tied all of the fishermen's and all of the ends started on one side. And so what that did, what we didn't realize, is that when you start stringing it through and pulling tension, the way that friction builds up and the tension begins is that you get these really uneven sides with all this weird bunching and these big gaps, and you get these other sides that have weird bunching, and it's not very symmetrical. You can kind of notice it once you start working with it for a while, just based on the way that everything tensions from the girth hitches and all. What we did the second time is we alternated. So as you can see, every once in a while we have a clove hitch, then a fisherman's, then a clove hitch, then a girth hitch, then a fisherman's, then a clove hitch, then a girth hitch, then a fisherman's. It keeps alternating. Because on the other side we have the other alternating fisherman knots. And that way, if you look at this, you can see this middle arc is much more symmetrical. This side can be pulled out a little bit, but it just kind of pulls the line in equal directions and kind of mitigates the weird bunching a little bit.
So what happens is when you string the tridents and you do the weave pattern, the am seal has a tendency to bunch up. So before threading all the am seal to the center, what you want to do is you want to make sure you go through the whole trident and you pull on the girth hitches and the clove hitches and the fisherman knots, so that the am seal is as tight and aligned as it can get, so that you have all the slack fed into the middle, and so that you don't have any bunching here. Because if you have bunching here, it'll allow it to slide around more, and we don't want that. We want the am seal to thread it properly. Now we're going to have a few bunching over there because this side of the space net is a couple inches shorter than the other two sides. And to add the 19th strand that we're going to do on each side, we need a little extra space. So that was calculated. But if you have the space, make sure that you elongate it out so that it works much better. So once you've elongated the am seal, I would recommend now to tie the Brummel knots. I would also recommend, again, to emphasize, to do the edging, the am seal, in trident sections and not the entire thing. If you did the entire thing like we did, we already tied the Brummel knots and we have a bunch of extra am seal in the center because of how the sides start to arc in with the tensioning of the paracord. So what I would recommend to do is tie the am seal to the midpoints while you're working on each end, and then to tie the Brummel knot to have the am seal go together in the middle. Then what I'm doing here over this time lapse is I am running 5 vertical lines from the corner and then from the sides of the space net to the middle to more equalize the circle, for me to get a better idea of how the circle is going to look while I run the last 3 sets of strands of netting. Then what we're going to do is we're going to run the last 3 sets of strands of netting. And I'm also going to show you how we did Anthony's. He opted not to go for a big circle that you could fit through with a plug. He opted to go for a smaller circle with everything going, with the netting going to that circle. I believe that that looks cleaner, but I also like mine as well because if I set mine up over the water, I'll be able to jump out. If you want to set up really high, you'll be able to hang off, just do fun things with it. Obviously, it's up to your discretion what you want to do and what kind of space that you want to build. So what we did here is we have all 3 tridents done, and we did 18 strands each trident, so we doubled it back. That's going to be 36 strands of paracord so far. And what I did is I kept the hole big, and I brought it to the hole, which I had as a 3-foot diameter, and did that. Anthony doesn't want to do that. He wants to make this all one piece and not put a cap in like I did. So what we did was, instead of shortening the sides to fit the hole, we kept the sides the same length, and we shortened the hole. This looks like a triangle only because it's not strung up yet. Now what happens here is, because we did one continuous loop of AM steel around the entire space net, we have this extra AM steel here. I would recommend doing one continuous strand of AM steel per trident as something, hindsight is 2024. Anyway, you must put all the slack of the AM steel, whether it was for one trident or the entire space net, in the circle itself, because we need these to be flush with the sides. And because these connect to each side, and then the side of the static rope must be flush, and you must not have extra here. All the extra must be pulled through and left on the circle. Now what we're going to do is going to string from the sides of the trident into the circle, and then we're going to fill in the circle. All right, so now everything's done. We built the cap on the side for my space net. We're not including that in this video because it's not essential for making the space net. Essentially, you can do whatever weave pattern you want. I did a star like Captain America's shield and surrounded it with a blue paracord. So the star was made out of AM steel and the blue was made out of paracord, which you'll see later. Then what I'm doing now is I'm tying off all the stopper knots to the clove hitches. Clove hitches can potentially come undone if you don't have a stopper knot on them. Every clove hitch on the space net has a square knot to stop it off. The other knots that were used were the fisherman's and the girth hitch, and both of those either ends at a fisherman's or ends at a clove hitch, and the clove hitch is stoppered off, whereas the fisherman's does not need to be stopper knotted off. Then what I'm doing is I made 9 small baby shackles, baby soft shackles to hold the hole in place. So the 9 baby soft shackles can hypothetically hold 3,000 pounds and each, so 9 of them should be more than sufficient to hold the cap to the circle.
We opted for a weave pattern over the original random knotted technique since each paracord is strung and weaved across individually. It will allow for easy replacement of paracord for regular maintenance. Also, this weave pattern has a very uniform look throughout the space net, allowing for a nice finished look, as you can see. Most importantly though, reducing the amount of knots used will allow for the strength of the paracord to be better attained and reduces the weight of the paracord and space net in general. The only visibly alarming part of this weave pattern would be the rope and rope action happening throughout the net. However, this is not a concern since the paracord will not move enough for it to pose a real danger. It will only stretch from those points of contact and not slide.
And then it's done. Alright, now that we're done building our space nets, we're going to tell you what we did wrong and things you should look out for in the future.
So one thing that's really disappointing because you lose some square footage on your space net, but it's always happening, is bowing. When you start to rig up your space net to start, it looks like a perfect triangle, but as you notice when you start working, it'll start to bow inward from the sides. The only way to really mitigate this is to, when you start building your space net, rig it up under pretty good tension. Not so much it would be out in the real world, but enough that those sides are pretty tight, so when you start putting in your netting, it only pulls in the sides so much. Also, with bowing, keep in mind that you're going to start losing a little bit off your diverters if you're using diverters, and you'll need to cut off the extra rope as you tighten those in as the sides bow together.
Another thing that we found was using our weaving pattern, we started with all along one side, going down to the other side, and then coming back for the whole trident. What we learned is that creates some large areas of weave that don't need to be there. It's not bad, it's not going to make it any less strong, but doing a fisherman's on the one side and then alternating it every other side makes for a much more evenly distributed weave pattern, and we'll show you some footage on why that is. But essentially, doing our weave pattern, you're best to alternate it through.
Now when it comes to measuring, make sure you measure correctly. When we were measuring out our paracord, some of them were measured too short and others were measured incorrectly along the span set, which caused us to have to unsplice all of our paracord and re-tie it in the correct spot and re-splice, which took a lot of extra time. Very brutal.
Our final tip is that if you have a great idea, or original process is that you should film it and reach out to Ryan at How Not to Highline and share it with the community so we can all grow from it. And if you don't, you shouldn't highline.